Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session of the Summer of Platform Organizations webinar series. I'm extremely excited to have all of you here and create a platform for open discussions on the future of organizing. I'm Shruthi Prakash, your co host for this discussion, and I'm thrilled to have Emanuele join us. Emanuele is the equity partner and entrepreneurial ecosystem enabling micro enterprise lead at the organization. He comes with extensive experience in planning and implementing platform strategies across multiple industries and organizations from around the world. Today, he'll be facilitating the webinar for us as well. In the previous episodes, we covered the topic of venture building and data products and how they associate with platform organizations. And today, I'm happy to share that we'll be talking about leadership in entrepreneurial and ecosystemic platform organizations. Among us, I'm happy to share that we have some really experienced industry veterans who have been kind enough to join us right at the end of the week on a Friday. So thank you for that. So we have Sergio, who's the Senior HR Director, Global Functions at Campari Group. We have Michele, co-founder MLab and co-author of Humanocracy. Paul Lambert, who's the founding director of Living Work Consulting, founding member of the European Organization Design Forum, and senior faculty at Henley Business School. And finally, Céline, who's the author of Dare to Unlead and the founder and CEO at We Need Social. As most of you know, at Boundaryless, we create open source frameworks and knowledge pools for platform design and entrepreneurial organization development. And we support a global community of organizations, institutions, and individuals to develop their platform development series. And we do these through our consulting services. Before we start, I would also like to nudge all of our listeners to keep this session interactive. So please drop in your questions, thoughts, feedbacks, or comments that you might have in the comment section. I'll make sure to take it up with the guests as well. I would also like to inform all the listeners that we have an online training workshop that will be conducted on Rendon High, and I'll share more details on this towards the end of our webinar. So do join in with us till the end. And now, before I take more of the time, I will pass it on to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, on to you.
Thanks so much, Shruthi. And again, let me thank our guests here. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you and to be able to call many of you friends. So today we are going to talk about leadership in a very different kind of organization. And a type of organization we are seeing more and more in the market to face some of the biggest challenges that we are all addressing. Specifically, when we talk about platform organizations, we refer to challenges in terms of the amount of diversity and the magnitude of stakeholders we want to engage. So no longer just one product, one client, but often many products, many customers, many clients, multiple types, especially of producers and consumers. We think about many products, but also many business models at the same time. So a firm that is betting in multiple directions, that is chasing multiple opportunities at the same time. We talk a lot about high levels of decentralization of power, high levels of autonomy for individuals, but also for teams. And these are organizations that act mostly as networking systems and enablers for others to create value. So it's crucial to help others to co-create value, not just to buy to get some service. We think about platforms as very quick and adaptive spaces, trying to anticipate or at least to cope with market shifts. And finally, we are thinking about platforms as a way to empower individuals to act as entrepreneurs, to foster innovation and often disruptions, and also to scale thanks to the componentization of internal services. So these kind of organizations are a bit different, and today we want to explore what's the impact on leaders and leadership due to this difference. So let me get started with the first round. And the first question I have, and I will call your names afterwards, is what is the mindset? So what is the kind of leaders we should look after when trying to foster platform organizations. So let me start with Céline, and then we'll go around.
All right. Well, thanks for having me in this webinar. I think this is a fascinating topic. I would say not only for platform organizations. The complexity that any organization is dealing with has greatly increased, and has been completely exploding for the past decades, I would say. So, what we would require from successful platform leaders is, I would say, not so much different from what we would require from any leader today. That is, for example, thinking in terms of systems and not just in terms of specialty, expertise, function, that kind of things. Being way more focused on the collective nature of the organization, and instead of splitting work in parts, thinking more in terms of design rather than in terms of tasks, that kind of thing. So the mindset, I wouldn't draw too specific of an ID card for the perfect leader, because we're, I think, as we all different in terms of human beings, the success of those organizations um, owes a lot to how we aggregate different perspectives and skills. And so the leaders today are need to be excellent aggregators, I feel. I will love to hear from the other guests here as well. And I'll,
Aggregators.
yeah.
Thanks.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Michele, I think you wrote a bit about this stuff, right?
Yeah, it's I almost like every time I hear the word leadership, I have a little bit of heartburn because it's a word that has been way hopelessly kind of misused and compromised. Because when you think about, you ask any person working in an organization of a certain size, you say, who is the leadership team? They will point to the C-suite, maybe the EVP layer, so the top 1% of the company. And if you think about leadership as, people who get mobilize collective effort to achieve shared goals and inspire others, it's not all clear, right, that the people at the very top of the organizations are leaders in that sense, and they're often not a team, right? They're often, kind of prioritizing their silo or their agenda over the collective good of the organization. And in a way, if you I did this analysis. If you trace back sort of the use of the word leadership and leadership development, it started kind of increasing quite significantly in the 1980s when management development and management, was actually the way you call those people at the very top of the organization. Somehow we opted for this brand upgrade. You don't want to be a manager, like it's kind of boring. Let's be a leader, right? We'll make you a leader if you come to our leadership development program, and so on. So anyway, I'll stop my rant, but all to say that I think definitions are important, and what we mean by leadership is important, right? And I think you're absolutely right, and Cindy was absolutely right. We need a radical kind of revision, of even our assumptions about who is a leader and what is leadership, right? Because I think if you think of like a spectrum, right, on the one hand, leadership could be defined as the ability to induce other people to contribute, like to the objective that we have as an institution, and that's kind of like it's really about exercising power over others, and that's kind of the traditional way we think about leadership. On the other end of the spectrum, you might imagine, and this is certainly what you see at Hire and a lot of these vanguard organizations, where leadership is the ability to multiply the capacity, right, of other people to achieve shared goals. And it could be people in your organization, it could be people outside in a broader kind of ecosystem, and so on. And that's really more about increasing the power of others, right? And so I think we got to make this flip, and then then think about leadership less about maximizing control and more about unleashing talent, less about leadership being associated with positions in the hierarchy, and more about a relational sense of leadership where you are leading with others and mobilizing others, right, where it's less about directing and more about mentoring, developing. where it's less about being a good manager that makes you a good leader. It's more about, are you entrepreneurial? Are you spotting new opportunities? Are you coalescing like a consensus around new things we need to do, and so on? And where the structure of leadership is less vertical and lateral, and really where the legitimacy of your leadership has to do with your value added, which is often attested either by the market or your partners or your peers, not your boss. So anyway, so those are some of the shifts that are pretty radical, but I think trying to fit traditional conceptions of leadership in this platform, flatter kind of organizational model that you talk about is just impossible, right? And we need to make that shift.
I feel we started strong, so trying to just demolish some of the few hundred years of thinking on leadership, and I like that. Paul, what's your take?
Well, I was going to build on what Michele said there, which was, if we first think about what is leadership, if there's kind of a gradual evolution rather than an overnight change, and we're talking about ecosystems as well, it's that kind of shift from directing efforts and it being seen as kind of the one who allocates the resources of the firm to the best outcomes, often financial, but also kind of social and physical, to more of in an ecosystem. I think we take inspiration from inspiring a movement. So when I start to think about this, I kind of think about, and I think you can take a lot of inspiration from outside companies, which gets quite interesting as well. So you kind of look at civil rights movements, you look at, I even looked at sort of a kind of movement of a revival. It was like kind of looking at different, social groups, having worked with kind of like a digital real estate, first with a creative agency who've set up as a collective. Actually, I think what you need in a movement is first, you need it. It's actually plural, but you need somebody first of all who's got a vision, something that people can buy into, and a sense of purpose, but not a sort of too highbrow. It's actually, in this case, it's a creative agency. They do creative comms and cultural transformation work, and it's really about getting passionate about the work and passionate about who they are. So you join this kind of, for want of a better word, a club. And I think it's leadership's job is first of all to say, this is a great club to join. Come and join my club. Come and join my movement. That's not enough in and of itself, but it's attracting those people in. So knowing some of the people from that agency, Hawksby Collective, I know one of the things that's been tricky sometimes is then to kind of get enough connections. So you need, if you read Gladwell's book, I quite like, on Tipping Point about movements, and he talks about the connectors, mavens, and salesmen. You certainly need somebody who's going to sell the vision in there, or people that are going to sell the vision. You're going to have to need, obviously, you're looking beyond the boundaries of an organization. So its leadership is much more about connections. There's some people who just can connect with a lot of people, and they're often nodes in sort of the social networks that make, so they're kind of they're network makers. And then there are sort of real sources of insight, which Gladwell calls mavens. And I think there's different ways of analyzing movements, but I think leadership as making a movement and thinking about the roles in making a movement are quite a good starting place for our kind of view of leadership in ecosystems.
Thanks. I think we already raised a number of points, but I will pick up after Sergio. Sergio, you have a blog. There is a treasury trove of content. You talk about leadership and organizational model. So what's your perspective? What is happening when we look at the evolution of leadership?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you have covered quite a lot of topics in terms of mindset, etc. And I've collected more than 150 leadership models, which really give an idea that it's almost impossible to define it. And the more that I'm going deeper into the meaning of leadership through this model, the more it's coming clear to my mind that there is one very specific aspect. There is almost a black or a negative aura around leadership, which can be traced to the fact that if you translate leadership directly in several languages, the immediate translation is negative in that context. Why? Because especially in a few countries, there have been some self-proclaimed leaders in the 20s and 30s, Italy, Germany are prime example, which took the translation of leader and added it as their job title for a period of time. And we know what happened. And for me, is this element, and Michele was mentioning that already, is the fact that unfortunately leadership is so much associated to guidance in terms of power that yes, we can go around this element of defining it, but it's very difficult to detach ourselves. And what you all underlined in terms of being an aggregator, being a mobilizer, they're all needs there. But unfortunately, with a lot of people, when we talk about leader, they expect a leadership team, or they expect one decision maker, which is why I think that the moment that we talk about new organizational model, a model where they are distributed, where there is autonomy, etc., I think we need to stick to new concept. Maybe stewardship is one of those. Maybe there are elements, because these words that we associate. Otherwise, I always feel we never do. We only took one. We go one step ahead and one step backward because of the misinterpretation. And I think that Michele, in your introduction, Emanuele, in your introduction at the beginning, you mentioned that in a platform organization there are so many multiple stakeholders that the challenge for leadership, or stakeholdership in this case of guidance, is to create connection with so many different actors. Yes, there is that, but I want to underline that the big challenge is also that those that are leaders or stewards in this type of organization, they also need to think about what is the meaning of work for the people that are involved. Because the moment that we take away hierarchy at the traditional, which is typically providing a framework for work, we actually need also to think about that. So the multiple stakeholder at that point is not just the products and what you underline, but it's also every person in the organization that you almost need to cater for. That's why the engagement from this point of view and the challenge is big. And that's why I think that we need to put a lot of psychological, sociological, systemic views to also understand how the role of people in organization are changing. And by the way, this complexity is a clear demonstration that it can never be just one person at the helm, really being the leader of everything. We need something a lot more distributed that get intrinsic of the work of everybody. And just to, Céline mentioned being an aggregator. We talked about being a mobilizer, being a multiplier. Imagine if everybody's a multiplier in an organization. So this entire element makes it a lot different. And it's an interesting path ahead also of what is the role and the autonomy in our organization. And it is a difficult one, I would say.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I see a bit of a paradox in what you are saying. On one side, you talked about multiplying capacity, you talked about inspiring movement, what is happening outside from organizations, within organizations, aggregation, stewardship. On the other side, an organization is still somewhat a coherent entity. So this is my second question for who wants to take it, is if we want to rethink leadership, and we can call it stewardship, I definitely like the suggestion, but is there anything that is still coherent, unique, let's say a sort of attractor for keeping the stakeholders or the people together? So somewhat that should set this common ground, while the rest may still change. You can be autonomous, you can take your own decisions, but what are the key aspects that must be set, let's say, once for all in the organization? I'm exaggerating a bit, and those that you can let everybody decide about. Who wants to take that? Paul actually started talking about the sense of you can call it purpose, let's say the vision of the organization. But what else? What is the core that will keep the organization together and that is in the hands, let's say, of a few people? And what instead can be left to everybody else in their leadership space?
I can say a word about what I feel is a critical starting point is the creation, the multiplication of networks, creating space, making it possible to connect and reconnect in multiple ways people in the organization on a continuous basis, making the system see itself through different lenses in order to integrate more of its complexity that will then enable it to absorb or respond or react to the external complexity in a better way. So this, I would say, the very first job or task of anyone, and I agree with you, Sergio. Leadership is such, and with you all, you said that leadership is a loaded word, very loaded. That's why I even called my book "Unleadership." I dare to unlead. If we could, for a moment, let go of this ideology of leadership, which still puts a lot of weight and responsibilities, requests on individuals, and instead consider the leadership work as a collective thing that we are in together. And so starting with together with developing networks, visualizing networks, enabling networks. And from then on, I feel that a network rich organization, whatever form it has, is an organization that can adapt and develop more of the self-organization kind of abilities that it needs to grow. But really, that would be my suggestion, is to start with creating, enabling, developing, visualizing, activating networks.
Thanks. What else? So, what should be, saying in another way, centralized or at least guaranteed in this world of freedom, autonomy, self-management, diffused leadership? Who wants to jump in? Paul.
I'll just sort of build on the earlier piece. I'm trying to find a good analogy, but the one I played around with the other day was almost like splitting the atom. It's you need a critical mass. If I go back to the kind of network analogy, movements, there are leaders and there are vocal members of it. You know, they might be you might call Martin Luther King the salesman of the civil rights movement, or one of them. So there is, but there are different aspects. That's one aspect, being the kind of salesman or spokesman of that. But I think what you do need is a kind of core that starts. You know, you can't spread a jelly. You have to spread, you know, atoms have to have reactions and then kind of spread. And there is something that's passed on for that. So I think there's almost ecosystems clearly grow. You know, Uber didn't become in umpteen countries overnight. It started somewhere. You know, all networks start somewhere. So there's a growth pattern. And I think it's about what's in that critical element. And I think it is something about something quite distinct and purposeful, because I've seen networks, for instance, somebody tried to set up a consulting network and it was just so vague. It was just another group of consultants. Well, there's quite a few of them around. I think it's having something genuinely distinct, unique that people buy into. I gave the example a second ago of the Hotspur Collective, and I think having met founders and people in that, they will just, if you get them over a cup of coffee, they will talk passionately about it, because there is something about how they work differently, how they release people. I don't think it's the term it the work style movement, I think, but it's allowing that hybrid working whilst still people are joining something. It does have that sense of club. So I think at the core is that sense of purpose, some shared values, something that's really genuinely distinct, and an aspiration that's different from others. Because I think, and it's while we're talking about books, I think that's part of what I want to get across in what I'm writing is, just like an individual has a personality, I think teams, I think organizations, but ecosystems have a character and personality. And I think actually, just to finish the point, is actually one of the things that goes wrong actually when two organizations come together is sometimes they don't realize they're bringing two identities together, and they never do come together. So I think there is it is that ability to spread a movement, but there still needs to be a sense of purpose in the cells and in the whole. I think that's pretty difficult to do, because we're all here talking. We'll mention a lot of the very successful ones, but there's a lot of very unsuccessful ones as well, because they haven't got those ingredients. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts.
Sergio.
Yeah.
Or
No. Go ahead, Sergio, please.
Yeah, I think that Paul, as you mentioned, the key element is who's kind of originating the purpose. And a purpose can, of course, evolve, but you need at a certain point somebody to start it. We're like kind of an organic metaphor applied to to organization as organism. And at the end, that's exactly what happens. You need to have the first cell, which is not the most important over time. It can it can change role over time, but you need to actually have that. And I think that once you have the purpose, of course, the purpose needs to be evolved, needs to be nurtured. There is a fact of leadership or stewardship around, which is what I actually wrote today a little bit about in my newsletter, about the difference between, do I create a coherent organization or do I create congruence in the system? And the difference is that for me, the coherence is easy, and it's the old way of doing it. You provide framework, rules, I provide, let's say, something that can get replicated over time, and it's more about a top-down approach, the rule book, the playbooks, etc., etc. To create congruence, I need to add the alignment around that. So I'm creating something that then goes towards the purpose that we defined, and that is, again, as I was mentioning before, a little bit of another difficulty, because it requires a little bit more energy, because it's not like creating a rule book and then applying it all over the time, but it's constantly creating the dialogue. And here is the difference around that. Because let's face it, also in a more traditional hierarchy organization with a leadership team that we're networked, we have been talking about informal organization for ages. But applying the rule book, applying the rules of communication, etc., means that you're taking a lot of the stress out of the system. Here instead, it's almost like you need to learn over and over. Every new cell that comes in, or every new entrepreneurial organization that comes in, you need to learn somehow, which I think comes to the point of what Emanuele mentioned before, that element about creating component or componentization, because of course you don't want to reinvent the wheel constantly, but it's about intentionally choosing what are the areas where it's okay to have rules, it's okay to have templates, it's okay to have it, and what are those that where instead we need to constantly build a dialogue and constantly build the relationship, the network, as you all call that. I think lives about these two elements. There are some that we can replicate. There are some which are probably the interfaces between those components where we really need to invest a lot more time. And I think this is probably the key element of this stewardship, as I called it before, and also the element which requires the energy and consumes a lot of energy.
I like the difference between congruence and coherence. Michele.
Yeah, no, fantastic discussion. I 100% agree with everything everybody has said so far. I guess my only bid will be this. If I look at organizations that have been able to practice leadership in a very different way, distributing that, thinking of it as a contextual activity that everybody can take part of, they've been able to do that while still maintaining coherence, consensus, convergence, coordination, control, all those kinds of things that were attributed to the single leader, the single manager in the old model. And the way they do that is by kind of reinventing the how. So it's not like there may be too much of control, too much coherence at times. And so you probably need to under index, but at the same time, you still need it. And so how do you get all the control that you need and none of the control that you don't? And I think it is by kind of being smart about changing the how of control and the coherence. That purpose is certainly a very good example. I was struck by, I ran into this interview with this guy who works as an engineer, fairly junior engineer at SpaceX. And you may know that SpaceX has this mission to make humanity interplanetary, like, which is as bold a mission as you can imagine. And he basically made the following kind of argument that basically our mission is to become multiplanetary. For that to happen, we need to colonize Mars. For that to happen, we need to build a heavy lift rocket, Starship. For that to happen, we need a more powerful engine. To build that engine, we need this particular valve assembly to work. And my mission, right, is to optimize the performance of this valve, right? So complete line of sight between kind of the mission, the purpose of the organization, and what that person's role is and what they need to do. And so in that case, like, the mission is the boss, right? Not some superior in the hierarchy, right? So mission is one, values is certainly another, which is closely related. If you think about an organization like Bertsorg, right? They, everybody who works there, they're like this amazing, fully decentralized home healthcare organization in the Netherlands with 10,000 nurses working in 1,000 self-managing teams. And they're all drawn to that company, that organization, by this idea that, we need to practice nursing the way we were taught in school, not the way managers, want us to do it. I mean, we want to restore humanity in the practice of nursing and make it much more relational and so on. So values, are another kind of glue that gives you guidance and coherence in a way that doesn't require administrative, supervision and rules and so on, right? So that's another. Transparency is big as well, right? If you know what, and you're kind of know about your performance and the performance relative to the customer expects of you and your peers expect of you, that helps self-correct the behavior that might be off kilter. Peer accountability, direct accountability to customer. So all those things in a way can substitute and do a better job at creating the control and the coherence than sort of the managerial hierarchy, right? And so it's really being smart about, like, how do we reinvent the how of control? In the case of hire, it's about their ecosystem contracts where everyone is kind of synced up together on a set of goals, set of targets, and their compensation and the upside is not only based on what they do, but the collective results of the entire bundle of activities. I mean, those are the kinds of things that give you that level of coordination and coherence, again, without the old and bad ways of getting it. So I think it's just really, Emanuele, it's not that we have to choose whether we have control or not, or casinos or not. It's more about being really smart about how we get it.
Well, let me provoke you still a bit. I buy into everything you are saying, and still looking around, I see many success stories in which there is one strong guy or one strong lady. And I suspect they not only created the first atom of the organization, but actually they pushed for quite a long time, and they protected for quite a long time, and that initial seed. And maybe they spend lots of energy in promoting an idea of an organization, an idea of some outcomes. So just to make some names, when we think about hire, probably there wouldn't be any hire without Jean Grumin. If we think about Gore-Tex, there would be no Gore-Tex without Bill Gore. And if we think about Morningstar, the same, and Burzorg without Jos de Blok. So at the end, there is always some crazy person or some visionary that single-handed, this crazy idea of an organization. So we are talking a lot about distribution, diffusion, disruption, and then we still need an individual or a very small group, but usually an individual to push the envelope. Isn't this surprising? And actually, this is a point of failure for those organizations, and actually a point of failure also for the market, because without this kind of people, we won't have more organizations like those that I mentioned. What do you think about this?
Actually, we may be contributing to this failure by promoting those systems that have a name, that have a brand, that have been pushed by one person, and and that sometimes become almost cult-like. So people would be in the holacracy cult or in the whatever cult. And sometimes you see organizations that after their founder leaves or that dis, uh, dismantle this whole system that was actually holding because of one individual. So I wouldn't pay so much attention to a specific system as a brand with a model with whatever, and pay more attention to how people are brought together in creating the system that works for them in their context, for their client, with their own challenges, and really stay away from pushing a system and having other organizations replicate a system that was invented elsewhere, because often it doesn't work.
What do you guys think? So do we need strong leaders to distribute leadership?
Well, if I may, on this, I mean, there have been over the past months or so also a lot of information about, for example, the 10th anniversary of Laloux's book on and reinventing the organization. And there are so many questions about why are there not thousands of organizations that are embracing this new world, okay? And I think that there are two ways of seeing it. One can be we're missing let me call them entrepreneurs for 1 second, because it has a little bit more of a positive connotation of the people that are kicking the first ball to actually make it happen. Because it is also true that there are a few cases where somebody started, but then the team coalesced, and we actually have some good community. I think Paul mentioned a couple of cases also before where we started creating networks. So there are a few examples, but they are not enough. I mean, there are a lot. I mean, they are not the hundreds of thousands that we would be expecting around that.
Mhm.
And I think that here there are two elements around that. One is that it's a lot more complicated around this organization, because you just don't have to concentrate on your customer, but you also have to concentrate on all the relationship internally, because there is not a playbook, as we were mentioning. So you have to reinvent the organization really, and you need to reinvent it almost every day as you learn. Okay, and Céline, you hit one spot. In order to avoid that, we try to go outside and look for benchmarks or something that we can copy, but this does not work. Because, one point is what I call sometimes the generally accepted organizational principle of the hierarchy. It's not that it's something working, but they're generally accepted. Most organizations work this way, and I don't have to explain them to the new hires that I'm bringing in. There is also a second aspect that I think we need to reflect on that, which is when we're thinking about people joining an organization, a lot of these people join this organization with different needs or different approaches to work. Not all of them are ready to engage themselves fully, okay, into a completely autonomous organization. Which also does not mean that this is only an elitistic approach, because I think, and I think that Michele, you've done a lot of work also on moving outside the purely, knowledge worker case. I really, there are some very interesting cases also of autonomous organization in service, in the steel industry, etc. So we've broken that element. But let's face it, it's easier if you have a number of people which all interpret work in a way where they can engage themselves. And there are a lot of people that are not necessarily there, especially in a moment where we need to think that our economic context is also, we are creating much, unfortunately, a lot more difference between the rich and the poor. There are a lot of more people that need to look at where the paycheck is coming towards the end of the month. And I think we need also to consider this element. Coming back to Emanuele's point of view, do we need leaders? We need somebody that initiates that. Okay, can we immediately associate this equates to leader? I don't know. Probably that's one of the definitions we were talking around that before. And we need, in many cases, to break, because there are people that are interested around, but they're to break the moment from the CEO that starts getting interested around and how he starts involving the entire leadership team and how he gets that cascading down, etc. So it's like so far it happened because it is easier if there is somebody that is really kicking the ball around and going around all of the burdens around that. Because I think that what we're missing is a little bit of a history of those that tried and did not succeed in this. Because probably there are also cases around that.
Who else wants to?
I can give an example of a piece of work I'm involved in right now, which I think provides possibly an interesting illustration of the seed. In that case, a company decided to work on its culture, and the CEO, so the seed in a way, decided to make space for others. So to not get involved directly. So to step aside or step back and instead create the possibility for the culture to be defined differently instead of him or her in this case deciding with the boardroom what the culture should be, what the values should be, what the vision should be, whatever. We created an employee driven, a volunteer driven employee podcast in which employees interview each other. There's a rotating team of volunteers, each in charge of a season of podcast. And in this season, they ask for stories, for examples, for how is the culture happening in your day-to-day? How do you solve problems, issues, dilemmas, etc.? And progressively, we get this accumulation of stories, which in the same time create connections and create agency with the volunteer teams that are rotating. And progressively we accumulate data. So we have data, a bigger set of stories, and from that moment, from a certain moment when we have enough data, we analyze, we identify trends, patterns, what people say, what they want, what are their aspirations, etc. And from all this mass of data and analysis, we create leadership conversations facilitated by the volunteers. So more networks, more networking the organization further. We create sense making with the help of the positional leaders, but always in relation with the the rest of the team. And from that moment on, that informs the following seasons of the podcast, the following volunteer teams, etc. And this process is replicated and amplified progressively, and there are conversations happening in the organizations. All this is creating a progressive and almost organic focus, or it focuses conversations and attention. And very importantly, we in all this, we're bringing the fact that it is complex. There's no, it's not black or white. You cannot solve problems in in a simple fashion way. So everybody needs to address the complexity of dilemmas and challenges. And for example, how do you reconcile or balance the diversity, everybody's different, and the unity? We're all in this together, and we need to go in a specific way. So but instead of this complexity being handed over or being handled by a small team up there, it is how can I say, distributed and integrated at hopefully each and every cell of the ecosystem. So that's an example of how this can be done. And funny enough, I managed to convince this client not to work on values because I think values are ambiguous, they are not enforceable, they are overused, they are distractive, they are risky. And above all, values are, I believe, human and very personal. We all have different values, and it's fine. An organization can have work principles, and that's what we're working on. What are the work principles? We are all different. We all have different objectives and so on, but we can align on work principles that we define together and that come from what the employees express.
Thanks. Any more comments?
Emanuele,
on
if I
this?
could just
Yes, please.
jump on because I do think you raise a really interesting paradox, and certainly the experience that I also have seen is that it does take a catalytic leader at the top, to initiate or at least support radical transformation, and this is often when it works. It often doesn't, but when it works, the person has enough time to shepherd this, to see it through. It's often because the organization is either started that way, a little born that way, like Lady Gaga, or it's gone through a near-death experience, or it's in deep crisis, and the person is able to turn it around. That's certainly the case of Handelsbanken, of Nucor. If you look at what Bill Anderson is doing at Bayer today, similar, right? He's kind of up against it, and he thinks that distributing leadership, distributing ownership is the only way to go. And they dedicate days of the week on this issue. This is not the 20th out of a 20 item list of priorities. It is like number one or number two, and it's reflected in how they spend their time. And they obviously like Zhang and others, they really think of their role as architect, not commander. And so they're trying to enable this and empower other people to drive the change. So I think that's all good. The question is, why do we have so few positive deviants, right? And I think you all alluded to the fact that, there are two explanations. One is sort of like, this is like niche and will forever be niche, a bit like polyamory. There's going to be like 2 or 3% of the population that has multiple partners, and it's kind of interesting, but it'll never go mainstream, right? Could that, or it could be, there are actually postcards from the future, and they're just showing us what's possible, and eventually that they will become mainstream, right? And if you think about even like Geneva, like being, adopting self-government and kind of more of a democratic government during the time of Rousseau in the 18th century, you could have dismissed Geneva as like, democracy can only work in small, cohesive cities where everybody, is kind of the same. They all know each other and so on. And then came the United States and other large experiments in democracy, which showed, no, you can actually scale this, right? And so I'm of the view that this kind of way of leading and managing is more like that than it is like a niche thing. But then we really have to tackle the diffusion mechanism, like what is holding us back, right? And I do think it is partly a practical issue, like how do you make this happen, right? There's no playbook, as we said before. Partly it's a political issue. The people that are in charge of these organizations have played that game, the bureaucratic game. So now you're telling them, well, the rules are changing, and it's like telling Cristiano Ronaldo, you're great at football, and then we want you to play handball. He's probably not going to like that, right? And then it's partly a kind of ideological issue, and like the stuff you learn in business school, and what even regulators expect companies to look like, reinforces this particular view of leadership. And so like, unless you change those things, you're not going to make much progress, and you'll be confined to seeing exceptions, people who are particularly, enlightening and enlightened, that don't want to take, and courageous. But like my dream is to find a way where, to operate in a world where, they're not the exception, and it doesn't take like a Jean Rumin to create these kinds of things. Like it could be a fairly typical person, right? And we're not there yet. And then the question is, how do we do that? And the work, I think, goes well beyond the individual organization. And it's more like, how do we change some of these system level features so that, these things are more the rule and not the exception?
Thanks.
Yeah. I was going to pick both what Sergio and Michele said. I like, Sergio, you said about we need a bit more of what works, but also what doesn't work. It's a bit like going on an organizational safari, really. And we need to go and see some of the animals that went extinct, as well as some of the ones that survived and are now sort of roaming the earth. And I think, Michele, you kind of said similarly, it's like maybe the environment, the early days, if we work on the premise that these kind of organizations have risen up because we live in a VUCA world or whatever else we want to say about the complex world then actually we're on a safari now. And actually the fact that we can learn, I think there are, I think that's the value of us writing, talking about this, is at least give people it's not quite the playbook, but hey, there's a few tools in the box, and these things seem to work for other people. let's give them to one another. And I've definitely seen it. I gave 2 examples earlier. I saw a brilliant example, really at scale, of an ecosystem organization changing. It's very much like Zillow, but it's not Zillow. Really changing the way that houses are sold across a number of European countries, and the level of sharing you can do, because they had there was incentives all across the system. We understood there was an understanding of how innovation happened within and between. And I think understanding some of those rules, going on this organizational safari and working out some of the archetypes, I think is useful, albeit it's going to be different. Back to Celine's point, which is it's going to be different. And I guess the last point I was going to make was, we've talked about leadership. I might just play with the word again and talk about leadership system, because I think one of the roles of leadership, particularly, I think Michele used the word architect. I think a big part of, I know, Emanuele, you kind of like what you've done in Boundaryless is to try and say what is the architecture of some of these organizations, have been quite concrete about micro enterprises, what the ingredients are, how they relate to each other, how they contract. I think that is important, because if you look at them, they're called different names. They're called micro enterprises, they're called mini factories, they're called squads sometimes. But there's an awful lot of similarities. We used to talk about whole work teams before that, and we're doing this in the 1980s to make sure the right ingredients there. But the architecting the leadership system and the organizational system, I think, is an important role of that leader. So yeah, how do you create a movement? Go on a safari.
Let me play again the devil's advocate, I think, and I think we have a very common perspective. And still, if we look at most of the organizations we know, so not the examples I mentioned, but everybody else, probably 99% of the market, I could personally mention some leaders that didn't behave in a way that multiplied capacity, in a way that unleashed talent, in a way that help people to feel engaged. So let me ask you, looking at your reality, your experience as consultants, as employees, what are the psychological and personal traits that the leaders, human beings, shouldn't have to foster some of the outcomes we have discussed so far? Because if I just give an example, I see many CEOs as narcissistic personalities.
Exactly.
And organizations that have been designed intentionally to promote this behavior. So unless you are like that, you are never going to be the CEO of the company, or you are never going to stay the CEO of the company. So it's not because human beings are bad, it's because the systems we have designed incentivize this kind of behavior. So what are the psychological and personal traits that we don't want to see in this new kind of organization?
I think you said it, narcissism, the fact that we conflate from the very from a long time, and everywhere in our social lives we conflate leadership with authority, with power, with accumulation of power or wealth, or and that we sort of idolize leaders, in even in the leadership literature, in the business literature, in political leaders, etc. So we contribute to, again and again, reinforcing the idea that leadership is an individual skill set. That some people are leaders and some others are not. That it's linked somehow to assurance and assertivity, speaking clear with a loud voice that makes me more leaderly than someone else, for example, and that it puts some people, those leaders, above others. And unfortunately, this is a self-perpetuating system. It's hard to go against that. But hope in organizations, especially in the kind of distributed organizations we're talking about, we can demonstrate in the day-to-day work that leadership is a collective capacity that emerges from a dense network of people, and that the major, I would say, the most successful psychological trait to make it happen is the capacity or the acceptance, how can I be, not being egoless, but being so assured of your own, power and whatever, self-worth, that you don't need to be idolized or indispensable. The more dispensable you make yourself, the better, I think, for leadership, for group capacity. So leadership, in my opinion, or unleadership as I try to define it, is the ability to make a collective so powerful, so great, so working so well together that you can actually disappear, that you can actually move on to and pollinate other collectives and keep growing and let the collective grow as well on its own without you.
I like it a lot. What else? I'm quite tempted to say that these traits are more feminine than masculine, but I don't want to get too into that. Who else has a perspective on it? What
I
do
think,
we don't want to see?
yeah, well, I have a slightly different approach on this because, yes, there are many things that I would personally don't want to see in traits of person on leaders, etc. But the question is, I think it depends a little bit from a situation. Now, of course, there are some moral and ethical boundaries that we don't want leaders to go through that. But we also have plenty of examples of people that have been successful, not just for their own ego, but they created successful organization that allowed a lot of people to flourish, okay, in terms of self-realization, not just economically. And we can really label some of these people within the narcissistic type that you just mentioned before. There are many leaders, I mean, known innovators, Steve Jobs, Walt Disney, just to name a few, which definitely had a few of those traits. So the question is, in the situation, what is that they delivered that worked? I think, Céline, you hit one spot. The legacy of a narcissist is very difficult to get because it sees with the same person that created. So if your ego is creating something that is preventing the replication of that, I think it's a problem. Like in many cases, when the founders goes out of a company, the company starts collapsing, and the founder, as a savior, needs to go back and save the organization. But we need to recognize that, unfortunately, in the more traditional sense of leadership we were criticizing at the beginning, there are multiple cases around that, because some of these systems work. And if we want to see, the leadership system, as Michele was mentioning before, and how you build it, it could actually work. Yes, I think that, that probably the element is leadership needs to be attached today even more and more to a moral compass to a certain extent, and this is probably the element that we need to look at. We need to look at an element where it needs to look into a systematic approach towards objective that we need to have as a society, and I think Michele hinted also on the fact that also for new types of organization to flourish, we need to start removing some of the, let's say, systematic barriers that exist around this. So it's difficult to say that there is only one trait that works, because I have a feeling, I've got a lot of experience in the past, for example, in the nonprofit sector. There are a lot of NGOs, a lot of organizations, a lot of associations where you still find narcissistic personalities, sometimes also around these people that actually have been leading movements, as we talked before, of renovation. So it is difficult to really connect leadership only, or positive leadership only, to some traits, as there are certain situations that we need to consider around that. And I really appreciate one element, and again, probably the link is, what you want is to make sure that you're creating a heritage for the organization, so that you're creating a system of leadership that makes sense also for the organization to survive you. That's probably the one element. So it goes beyond your own ego. That probably is the only trait that I think, if we think about organization beyond just one person, that we really need to look at.
Yeah, I gave a talk recently about, and the concept is not new, about the kind of life stages of an organization. There was a Larry Greiner's famous article, like, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago. But it made me think about leaders as leaders, plural, as kind of parents, or kind of, and the stages. And one of the, Sergio, to build on what you said, one of the classic problems about organizations growing is, the person who does the startup doesn't know when to leave or step aside, and is still trying to control it. When they had 10 people, they're still trying to control it 1,000 people. It doesn't work. So there's something about, I think, some of the traits. Let's go with the parent analogy. The ability to spot the talents of those within, the ability to kind of see what stage of development both individual members and the group are at. I think some of these things, that's why I meant about when I went back to the kind of the idea of the movement and splitting the atom. You have to have a critical mass first. And, when you've got a little startup and it's just two of you, that's not critical mass. It probably needs to get to 10, 20, 30 people. And then you suddenly see, those people across there, we might have started, in the collective, we started doing sort of video work, but those kind of guys do design work. But we share the same ethos. And then actually for the leaders to kind of say, or the leaders to say, we need to pass it on to them, for want of a better word, the next generation. Or the people who can understand how to work in that, and we need to play a different role, which is more orchestrating the system. So I think there is sort of times and seasons in it, and it's like I think there is in even standard leadership. So I think that part for me is it's much more developed about you're effectively cultivating a group of people. You're being a parent or gardener of those. And Michele said earlier about there's a system level to this. I think we talked about, I think, had a long chat the other day with another partner from the firm I used to work at, and talked about the difficulties of working in companies, quoted companies, limited companies, who, particularly those that are very focused on the next 3 months, the next quarter's results. It becomes very hard to cultivate an ecosystem when I don't really care whether you're growing capacity here. Are we going to hit the number in the next quarter? So when we start talking about value-driven, triple bottom lines, 3 Ps, and all this kind of stuff, I think I don't think it's an accident that a lot of the best experiments so far, the Patagonias and things like this, have come from people who there's a long-term commitment to this, or they're still in family owned, or they're kind of owned, but certainly by a group of people who are invested in the same ideas. So there's a system level in which that sort of cultivation can happen.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and Emanuele, in defense of the narcissistic leader, I would say, if I can, it's not all their fault. It's not all their fault. It's not just because they're bad people. It's also very convenient for the rest of us to have someone in charge. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. It's the leader, the CEO, the president, the whatever, Cool. So it's also us handing over our agency to someone else and making that someone else become indispensable, and maybe that will affect his or her psyche, and it's all something we're all in this. We're all making those leaders as well. Huh? It's not just them.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Céline, just we talked about, Michele talked about the growth of democracy. I think one of the conditions around democracy is that we not just, and because there's a lot of, we're very down on our political leaders now, but actually it does also require, as Winston Churchill said, people get the government they deserve. If we stop being politically active and representing views and sort of speaking up for, inequality or whatever it is, whatever justice issue, we get the government that is sort of, less and less democratic, truly,
Yeah.
because we have to be good Democrats as well as they have to be good politicians.
Let me pass the ball to Michele, but just raising another point: is that even conceivable to think the organization not just a few oligarchy of leaders, but an organization in which everybody is a leader and which innovation is diffused to everybody? I know you have been working on this for a bit, not just talking about it, but also working on it for a bit. Is that possible? We're talking about an organization in which we have not one or two products, not one or two leaders, but thousands of experiments, thousands of areas of innovation, and thousands of areas of leadership. Is this something that you see happening, Michele?
Yeah, I mean, it's as we said, it's not common, but it's definitely present. I mean, there is a growing, small but growing band of vanguard companies that are trying this, and where yeah, the idea of leader is one where it's the idea of everybody is a leader. If leadership is defined as mobilizing collective effort towards kind of productive ends for the organization, and I don't think you can do that though with like 10 layers of management. I don't think you can do that with huge staff functions that centralize activity and tell people what to do. So it does require a fundamental and structural rethink. Um, and which kind of goes back to your question about traits. I mean, I'm almost like, I mean, yes, you don't want people to be a-holes, right? And so, okay, so those maybe they can be productive. Most of the time, they don't, and we shouldn't be fooled by the few exceptions of where a-holes are actually successful, because most of the time they're not. But in general, this to me, like this idea of searching for leaders who are authentic, humble, all those things, all the positive kind of versions of the negative traits you were alluding to. To me, it's almost like a fool's errand, because like organizations need to work. I mean, how many of those people? I mean, you're basically looking for traits that put together like Desmond Tutu, Mother Teresa, Jesus, Winston Churchill. Like, how many people are you going to have who fit that profile, right? And so it's almost like you want to build organizations where ordinary people can exercise leadership and inspire others responsibly, right? And which means probably not selecting for a different kind of person, but also not concentrating power in that way, right? Because I mean, the United, some forget who said it, but the United States was designed by geniuses to be run by idiots, and we've come pretty close to that illustration several times. But I mean, like, I think that's kind of the mode, right, for building organizations that distribute leadership. Like, they need to operate with ordinary people, right? And and so that then in a way is our challenge. And this, the sooner we stop like looking for building leaders that fit this impossible conception of virtue, I think that the sooner we stop doing that, the better.
I think what you described is really a big risk, also because of what Céline said. Trying to have bad systems and to hope for good people to save the systems, when those good people will escape sooner or later. I've seen many leaders, good people with good intentions and great abilities, just being fed up of managing the system, wasting their energy just to do up management and to get nothing as a result. So I think talking only about individual traits, it was a provocation. Talking only about individual traits without addressing the systemic part won't bring us very far. You may be lucky, you may have a good CEO, but he will retire sooner or later. He cannot survive forever. So I think it's very important to tackle at least also the system level. Shruthi, I think you had a question, right?
Yes, I've actually been listening in and making a ton of notes here to my side. So, I mean, before I ask the question, right, just some points that sort of stood out to me as well. You mentioned, I think, Celine, that dispensable is better and focus, let's say, needs to shift towards collective strength, right? Essentially. So for me, in the context of, let's say, like an Asian context, it's so difficult to picture that, even though by theory I would like to agree, by practice it's so difficult, simply because I mean, I'm in a population of, let's say, 1.5 billion. I'm highly replaceable, right? Like, I work from that mindset of operation. So it is really interesting to sort of hear your alternate perspective on it. I hope that we can get there. The question, let's say, that I wanted to ask, right? Like, currently there is anyway, there's so much of resistance. Like, Mikkel, you pointed out that even, let's say, ordinary people need to be considered for leadership roles and so on, and there needn't be like the perfect person to sort of lead the team and so on. So we are currently in a space which is hypercritical, hyper opinionated, and more so with time it's getting more so, right? And there is resistance which is either open, or there is, let's say, subconscious sort of resistance, in the sense that either it's passive aggression, there is maybe avoidance of decision making, things like that, right? So there are subtle versus heightened sort of display of resistance from organizations. So, how do you first sort of identify these as leaders, quote unquote, and then how do you sort of go deeper into identifying these invisible and subtle forms of resistance?
So leaders and resistance. So we are talking about change. Finally, yeah, we didn't mention this word, this word so far. I'm impressed. Who wants to take on
I
this? Yeah.
can say a word about it. Resistance is, how can I say? I find it's not a misleading term, but an easy term to use that sort of puts the blame on others instead of, and that prevents, that is very convenient for people to avoid looking at their own responsibility. How did they um, plan, involve other people, design, create the space, create the capacity? Did they take a shortcut to the expected result and then, oh, faced resistance? Well, duh, yes, of course. If you did not involve people from the start, of course you would face resistance. I often hear senior leaders talk about the problems they face in execution. They say the problem is execution in our company, as if strategy, which is handled at their level, was all perfect. The problem is the others, like down there, right? Ah, it drives me nuts when I hear those words. I get very suspicious when I hear resistance to change. The problem is execution. Those kind of things. I'm like, that's a sign that yeah, that it's very top, they're very push. It's a push where they are still in those push approaches instead of enabling, connecting, collective co-building. I know it takes more time. I know it's more difficult, but it is what gets to the results in a sustainable way. It builds capacity. It builds agency instead of contributing further and further to this powerlessness that drives people mad, and that creates this anger we're finding out there in society, that it gets expressed through politics, because people they're not involved enough. They don't have a say. They're not respected. They are considered as disposable elements in those so-called agile companies. Agile mean you can lay off 3,000 people right away, when still the day before you were telling them they were indispensable because you share the same values. So people are sick and tired of that. They don't want to hear that anymore. So why would you embark them easily in the new fad, the new organizing model? People are very cynical. So it takes time, a lot of time, but it's worth it to build those networks, to build the trust. But of course, it has to start from a position of authenticity, and instead of a pure short-term financial result-oriented position.
I just want to build on how that works in practice, because we, some teams, some groups. I quite like the conversation we had earlier about let's study what works, but also what doesn't work. In fact, that's often the most interesting. And some teams don't work. There are some people who are, for want of, back to your question, are resistors in some way. And I know, back to kind of Belbin and people like this, kind of like, studying what's in there. I think one of the beauties of some of the ecosystem models is cells can fail while the body can succeed. And I think it is important there's some feedback mechanism, but as Céline says, not of the traditional kind, not of the do I say, but you guys get together and try and make some money with your idea. Go for it. And some of you will, and some of you won't. And you trade with people, and you kind of... so I think it's putting in place the conditions for some of that. I guess it's, if I was to keep bashing on about a theme, it's that sort of critical mass. Good teams, good leadership teams, good teams are essential to this, because they're the small enterprises that you build. They're the cells of the body in this new kind of model. So I think resistance is futile. It's like eventually the cell will die in the right kind of architecture. Whereas in fact, there's a lot of, in quite large corporates, there can be whole corners that have been unproductive for years, and they're sort of forgotten. That's the irony of it, is actually there's this top-down control, but actually sometimes deeply unproductive elements of it. And I think it's partly the design that kind of brings that out. To make a very practical example, somebody was saying why in the UK we've had a lot of innovation in local government. They've been squeezed for money, but they've done very well because they can fail. And there's some spectacular examples in the UK of our local council. Woking has gone spectacularly under with a big debt, but some have done it amazingly and produced. Whereas our health service, though more Brits worship the NHS as a national religion, has some very unproductive bits of it. And everybody, politicians now admit that, it needs changing. But one of the reasons is that it's actually very hard for a hospital to go bust, truly bust. We wouldn't like it. We wouldn't like our local hospital. So I think there's this correction mechanism in the system that will actually knock out resistance if you get some of the design and the architecture of the system right.
Thanks. Any other perspective on this?
If I can just add on a point, right? Does resistance necessarily have to be from a sort of negative connotation? That's something, yeah. Because for me, resistance is also good because it's an opportunity to voice, right? Essentially. So it needn't be that I'm not in alignment, but more that it's an opportunity to, let's say, express and maybe go from there.
Yeah, no, I think it's... sorry, just a very quick comment. My dad was involved with, the reason I mentioned Belbin, when he was working in a big water authority with a lot of Belbin's team experiments. And, the diversity and the resistance in the team was very useful. Those are the most productive teams, if you read back as well. And there's a particular role called the monitor evaluator. But what was found about it is they really helped to make it productive. But given the opportunity, they're the first person everybody would chuck out the team. So it's quite interesting that, a bit like an antibody in a body, you're absolutely right. I think we're trying to encourage diversity for exactly the reasons you say, and resistance, because they've got a different perspective. But, it's a classy organization can hold that.
Yeah. If I may, and I want to connect to what we were discussing before, I think that the problem here is, and it's also on the resistance and also on the difference between if the resistance is negative or positive, it's how our egos in general are coming into play. Because if I think also in a lot of the deviations that we see from an organization effectiveness point of view, it's when somebody's trying to make himself or herself indispensable in an organization. That's what Céline mentioned very much before. I mean, she proposed an alternative system of leadership where you make yourself dispensable, and that is a different route, but it's not the route that many of us take. Think about the bureaucracy that Michele has been describing so well. In theory, it's not bad alone, the bureaucracy as Max Weber described it. But the problem is that it's a self-sustaining mechanism that grows because every pieces of it wants to make itself indispensable. And this is the problem. And this is the problem in a lot of our organization. Each of, how many people invent parts of their role so that they feel that, I cannot be replaced around that. However, but what is interesting around this element is that up to a certain level, this is positive within the organization. So the resistance that you actually get, and I mean, Paul, I think you mentioned at the beginning the fact of already in the 80s, the forming of teams with small specialization versus the typical, chain in terms, for example, of production, etc. But if you think about it, you gave different role to people, which means each of the person was somehow indispensable within the team. So there is a layer which is positive around that, also in terms of resistance, when I want to get my voice heard, etc., etc. And this is actually, it's also the basis of the autonomy that we're seeking in that direction. I really liked your reference about the polarization that we see also in the outside world, because where is it that it is coming from? So many sociologists now agree that a lot of that polarization is coming because there is a group of people that are really loudly asking to get their voices heard because somehow the system was not giving them a voice. And this is the piece. How do we live now in a polarized voice, in a polarized world where people are screaming, not just giving their voice, they're screaming. And we get at the same time to get change. Emanuele, you said, but this is all about change. This is all about transformation. How do we get there? Because one of the problems that we see, and we see it also in traditional companies, is that, you want to go good, you want to get your D&I initiative. And you have resistance from people for the same reason that you have a resistance on this topic outside. And how do you address this internally? And an organization, even the most traditional one, are investing a lot of time to get people to understand, change their behavior, and we can question if this is positive or not. And I like what Céline mentioned before about values. It's very difficult to work on the values of the people. But probably our organization don't listen to the voice of people that wants to get heard. And this is the resistance point. And I like, Céline, what you mentioned. If there is a change and it's fading, yes, because of the resistance of the other, that's very easy to do it. If you're a consultant, it's okay, because of course you're outside of the organization. But when you're in, that alibi doesn't work. And so how do we create those involvement mechanisms? And I think that's the triggering element also moving to new organizational model, because otherwise it doesn't work. This is the tension element. And here, I think, coming back to the stewardship and what we mentioned is, this is the loop that we want to get, the initial cell that we want to get around the transformation. Because effectively what we're trying to get is, we're giving voice to people without necessarily going in the route that each of them is creating their own ego dome, making themselves indispensable in a traditional organizational model.
Michele, something to add?
Yeah, amen to all of that. I mean, I would say, one of the things that drives me crazy is when I hear an executive say, people are against change. I mean, it's like, okay, think about to the audience on this call, like how many of you this year have changed jobs, changed maybe partners, changed cities, changed hobbies, tried new things, right? And cooking or something like that, parachuting. We're like change addicts as individuals, but somehow there's this assumption that we are against change. I mean, I guess, as Céline mentioned, we're against change that is kind of shoved down our throat, that is imposed, right? And so, we're not change phobic by nature. So it's really about like, how do you get more people to weigh in on decisions? Again, not in necessarily creating a democracy or even trying to generate consensus, but giving people a voice, right? I mean, and this, by the way, could be a very interesting way to channel insights that even provide a good healthy check on corporate, executive hubris. I mean, one company that does this really well is Netflix, right? So whenever they want to make a big change, and some of it even smaller changes, like, hey, let's get into kids programming or let's enter this market, the executives have to put up a memo, very small memo, but it kind of explains the logic and then hundreds of people get to rate it. I think it's on a 20-point scale, +10, -10. And they kind of annotate it as well. Like, I gave you a -8 because of X, Y, and Z, and so on. And it's so public, so everybody can see what everybody else is doing. And is that resistance? Maybe, if you're skeptical, but it does provide very meaningful feedback, right, on decisions. And so, I mean, that's the kind of model that I think should be. I mean, and again, Netflix isn't like this. I mean, they're a very unique company with a unique culture and a very enlightened leader, but they are a publicly listed company, with a fairly standard management structure and so on. So, like, if they can do it, this could be more widespread. The reason why it doesn't happen very often is that leaders may actually not want to. Executives may actually not want to know. Right? And therefore resistance then becomes it goes underground, and it's very harmful.
Thanks. I think we are near to the closure of this very nice conversation, at least for me.
Yes.
Shruthi, I think we have some comments from our friends online.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, thank you firstly for all of you for joining, and just some quick, let's say, comments that came in online, right? I think most of the comments were sort of in agreement as well. So Sarah spoke about how she said it's a fabulous background boost, and she's finishing a talent and leadership strategy for her integrated care systems. And she spoke about how a fundamental challenge is that multiple people are batting in different directions. That was one of the points that came out. And a few of the other points were how leadership needs to shift towards leader and then ship sort of highlighted, so the whole collective. And one more on how we could think about leadership from the point of view of a forest where there is no lead tree, like there is only an entire forest, like a mycelium, for instance. So these were some of the comments that came in. I wanted to also share it on this platform. Yeah, I will pass it to Emanuele to maybe summarize the session for us and the key takeaways maybe that can be shared with all the listeners.
Thank you so much. Yes, I just I think we covered lots of ground, but I think there's some points for me stood out. The first one is that maybe leadership is not the right word. Sergio suggested stewardship, but maybe there are other ways to say it. But yes, it's a collective, and Céline talked about emergent,
Yes.
effort and the exercise. So we may rethink who the leaders are and what leadership is. Paul talked a lot about inspiring a movement, right? So creating this energy, and Michele talked about multiplying capacity, increasing power. So creating many leaders, as many as we can, unleashing talent. And trying to mobilize the people. We talked a lot about what stays at the center. We described as the purpose, the vision, and Sergio also described this difference between coherence and congruence. So maybe we have to relax some of our expectation of having a neat, perfect design and go with the flow and look for the minimum viable, let's say, coherence that we could call the congruence we can think of. We talked a bit about the traits of leaders, especially those that we don't want to see, but concluded that probably this is more a system exercise. So it's more about architecting the systems than just praying or hoping to have Jesus or some other, right leaders in the wrong context. And I think we ended with the perspective in which the system is very much decentralized. The forest, Shruthi was describing now, in which we must amplify the possibility for individuals and teams to be leaders, to run. Paul was talking about, to build their own thing, to fail with their thing. And maybe this is the key to winning resistance. At the end, there is no resistance if you do what you want to do. And if you are empowered, maybe to fail, but at least to fight for what you care. I think somehow we depicted a different idea of leadership, not perfectly, because I think it's intrinsically impossible for what we have said,
Yes.
but giving a bit of direction on what we would like to see and what some organizations are trying to experiment with. So thank you so much for your time, your ideas. Thanks for the comments online. And Shruthi, I will let you to conclude.
Yes, I will take just a minute more. Yeah, thank you all of you firstly for joining in. Again, it's a Friday. Thank you so much. Thanks for all the listeners who have been patient and joining us as well. Just a quick pointer. So, as I mentioned earlier, Boundaryless is conducting a online training program on the higher end and high organization model, where you'll be taught from the basics to the advanced concepts and practical approach of sort of implementing this in your organization to develop entrepreneurial strategies. So the course is taking place in the end of November, and I've shared the link in the comment section as well. So we hope you can join in. And with regards to the webinar series itself, we have one last webinar that is scheduled for the 13th of this month. So that's on effective team dynamics to support platform organization strategies. So we hope that you'll continue to support us and join us on the 13th as well. And for today, we hope that you've gained something with your from how you've spent your time with us. So we're really thankful for that. The entire webinar, along with the keynotes and the links to the panelists' profiles, will be shared via LinkedIn, YouTube, and all our other media platforms. So do keep an eye out for that. And thank you once again, all of you, for joining. Do remember to think boundaryless. Bye. Thank you.